Good to go, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, can I welcome all the members and officers to this hybrid meeting of the Cleaner Communities Overview and Scrutiny Committee. This meeting is able to be viewed live by members of the press and public today. Therefore, may I welcome anyone that may be watching remotely. A recording of this meeting will be made available on the Council's webcasting and YouTube channels after the meeting has concluded, should anyone also wish to view it. To confirm, as a council, we welcome the use of the Welsh language within our public meetings, but I can confirm I have not received any notification or requests to use Welsh today. Therefore, the meeting will be conducted in English only. Can I remind members to refrain from using the chat facility and instead use the raised hand icon to indicate when you wish to speak. Please could you also keep your microphone muted when not talking so there aren't any interruptions encountered, but I'm sure I'll have the odd slip now and again, as we often do. Moving on to the agenda, perhaps if Niall can confirm if we've had any apologies.
Morning, everyone. No, Chair, we have not received any apologies.
Okay, thank you very much. So we move on then to the declarations of interest, item 2. So could I ask members in alphabetical order to state whether they have any declarations of interest to make? So I'll go with Councillor Ashley.
None.
Okay. Councillor Clarkson.
None, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Evans.
None that I'm aware of, no.
Thank you. Councillor Haynes.
None that I'm aware of.
Councillor Haller.
None that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Councillor James? Not present, I think. Councillor O'Connell?
No.
Thank you. Councillor Parish?
Nothing that I'm aware of.
Thank you. And myself, similar, none that I'm aware of. So, okay, we'll move on to item 3, which was the minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of July. Obviously, those minutes related to the update reports we had on the progress of recommendations and progress against adapted action plans from the previous cycle of meetings. So could I ask if anyone's got any points they wish to raise in conjunction to those minutes? And if not, we can take them as agreed. I can see no hands. Great. I think we can accept those as agreed then. If we could note that, please, colleagues. Which moves us on to the action sheet, which in this instance is blank. So I think we can move through that quite quickly as well. Which brings us to our substantive item, item 5, which is the weed management report. So before I ask Daniel Morelli to introduce this, I think it would be helpful if we could do brief introductions as to who's in the chamber and those of us online. So I think if I start as Councillor David Williams, Llanraban Ward and Chair of this Scrutiny Committee, could I ask then on screen Councillor Ashley, if we could go through alphabetically? You're mute, Councillor Ashley.
It's doing it automatically. Councillor Stuart Ashley, Councillor for Pont Newydd, also Chair of Scrutiny for Cross-Cutting.
Okay. Steve?
Yeah, Councillor Steve Evans, Upper Cumbrian, I'm Chair of Licensing.
Councillor Haynes, Elizabeth?
Yeah, Elizabeth Haynes, St Giles Ward Councillor.
Okay. Linda?
Councillor Lynn Clarkson, Aberystwyth Ward.
Norma?
Norma Parish, Councillor, one of the councillors for the Panteg Ward and Chair of Planning.
Okay. Jason?
Yeah, Councillor Jason O'Connell, part of the Lantana Ward.
Thank you. Nick?
Councillor Nick Haller, representing Blanavon.
Okay. And Geraint, could you ask the officers present to introduce themselves as well, please?
Yes, no problem, Chair. Geraint Thomas, Scrutiny Officer. I'll hand over to Dan.
Good morning, members. Dan Morelli, Head of Public Protection and Environmental Services.
Good morning, Rachel Edwards, ecologist for Torvine.
Good morning, Louise Powell, interim manager, environment and street scene.
Good morning, Steve Smith, grounds team leader, Bronavon.
I'll jump in on that.
Thank you.
And Simon Morgan, places and spaces manager. It's basically grounds team, Bronavon.
Thank you very much. So welcome everybody, and I think I'll pass on then to Dan, who's going to introduce the report. As I say, we will all assume we've all read it, Dan, but so just go through the key points, and if there are colleagues who need to come in with any points, because then we'll move into the questioning, having prepared. So over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Chair. And I am aware you've all received a copy of the report in advance of this meeting, so I intend to summarise it section by section rather than reading through it line by line. So just in terms of the purpose of the report relates to the Council's approach to weed management, and we are here today to provide the committee with an update on the findings of a trial commissioned by Cardiff Council on the effectiveness of different weed control methods used across Cardiff, and also to invite the committee to make recommendations to the Executive Member for Environment to inform the Council's future approach to weed management. In terms of the background within the paper, there is a section in the report which explains how the topic has previously been subject to scrutiny, with a focus on the Council's use of glyphosate, a herbicide. It also contains information on previous consideration given by the Council, and also in relation to two petitions that have previously been received by the Council seeking an end to the use. Sorry, there's some interference.
Listen to him.
Is there a problem, sorry?
No, that's fine. Sorry, Dan. Carry on.
Okay. So, as I was saying, the background to the report also contains reference to two petitions previously received by the Council seeking an end to the use of glyphosate, and it outlines the Council's decision at the time to continue to use glyphosate whilst monitoring safety information, the availability of alternatives, and approaches taken by other local authorities. Details are also provided in the background relating to the contract in place for weed control on Council and Bronavon land, and also the in-house arrangements for treating Japanese knotweed. When we move to the section on information and discussion, this sets out the research on glyphosate. The status of glyphosate has not changed since it was previously subject to scrutiny back in 2018. The European Chemicals Agency's Risk Assessment Committee's latest review has also concluded that glyphosate cannot be classified as a carcinogen, as this is not justified at the time that they considered it. The summary contained in the report of the independent weed control trial in Cardiff, which took place in 2021, the full report is included as an appendix. The trial sought to measure the cost, environmental and customer and quality factors associated with the use of glyphosate and alternative products, trialled alongside particular wards within Cardiff. The two alternative products that were trialled were acetic acid, which is effectively a strong type of vinegar, and hot foam. The table in the report at 4.2.4 summarises the outcome of the trial. Based on the key criteria, it was found from that trial that glyphosate provided the most effective and sustainable weed control method. Within this section also, the report refers to the pros and cons of integrated pest management weed control methods as well, so information is referenced there. And this comprises of a combination of cultural, physical, biological methods. The report also contains detail on what is deemed by cultural, physical and biological methods, and the integrated approach is one that uses a combination of those. Within this section of the report, there is also information on Welsh Government advice. The latest Welsh Government position relevant to glyphosate is included. Welsh Government has been working with stakeholders across the UK to develop a new national action plan on sustainable use of pesticides, so information is contained in the report on this matter. And the plan sets out actions and timescales to meet the aim of minimising the risks and impacts of pesticides over the next 5 years. There are also some examples provided in this section of the report relating to different weed control methods adopted by other local authorities. It's noted that most local authorities continue to use glyphosate, but a small number have ceased its use. An example provided in the report is Brighton and Hove, who have taken an approach to employ seasonal staff to manually remove weeds, but the indications that are provided to us from this approach is that it's not proven to be hugely cost effective, and there have been other issues in terms of resourcing that approach. The other approach mentioned as well is one taken by Lambeth Council, where they've introduced a community weeding scheme, and this relies on residents taking responsibility for weeding, but as is indicated in the report, that is not without its risks, and the effectiveness of that approach as well is not yet publicised. And lastly, within this section of the report, there's information about Torvine's proposed future approach. So based on the research, the trial findings and the latest guidance, the report proposes a risk and place-based assessment be undertaken to inform our future approach to weed control. Stakeholders will need to be engaged in this process, so we're cognizant of that, including members of the committee, partner organisations, Bron Avon, and clearly the communities that we serve as well. So there will be a process around engaging and to get views of residents about our future approach to weed management and the use of glyphosate. You will note in the report, in the consultation section, there is information provided on who has been consulted on the report, so I won't run through those stakeholders, but you'll see that from the report. And there's also a section on implications as well, so the financial implications to the council for its current weed management arrangements are detailed, and also the risks are detailed as well for not effectively controlling weeds. And the section then in relation to next steps for the committee, as I indicated in the front part around the purpose of the report, it's for the committee to make recommendations for the executive member to consider the future approach to weed management, and that summarises the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dan. Can I ask if any other officers have any comments they'd want to add into what Dan has outlined, or are you happy to wait for questions?
Not at this moment in time. We're happy to wait for questions.
Okay, thank you. And can I please note as also as a matter of record that we are grateful that a number of members of the public submitted questions and comments in relation to this topic, which have been shared with the committee as you know, their contributions have been welcome. So if I can then move to members, we have we have formulated a number of questions, and I think all members will have a copy of the questions in front of them. So I propose to go through in order. What we've done is we've aligned these as best we can to the different sections of the report. So I'll invite Councillor Nick Haller to start us off.
So question number 1 on the agenda item 5, 3.2. What areas are prioritised and included within the new contract in March of 23? Does this also include car parks, particular types of pavements? And also, are we able to ask the contractor to return to missed areas within the contract? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Councillor Haller. In terms of the contract that we have in place with the company known as Complete Weed Control, the contract covers the control of weeds on footways and other hard surfaces within public areas within Torvine. So that's all hard surfaces in public areas within Torvine, and as I mentioned within the report, it also covers not just the council-owned land, but also land in Bron Avon ownership as well. And I can bring colleagues in from Bron Avon should they wish to add anything in addition to what I've said. In terms of our monitoring arrangements, we have, when the treatment is underway, which happens on two cycles, a first spray which happens in April and May time, and then a second spray between September and October. During that time, the contractors are expected to submit weekly reports through to us so that we can monitor and cross-reference the areas that they have covered. So staff within the council will look to see whether any areas have been missed as part of that process. If they identify any areas that have been missed doing that cross-check, we will contact the company, and the company will revisit to undertake a spray, because it can happen on certain occasions that areas are missed, unfortunately. So we've got a process of monitoring in place so that we can introduce that sort of corrective action as and when needed. Is there anything you wish to add?
Just to reiterate and repeat that, I mean, we would monitor our own bits and pass, because you manage the contract on our behalf, so I mean, very similar to our approach. So, agreed.
Thank you. Can I just come back? Thank you for that answer. We talk about Torvine and we talk about Bronavon. What other housing associations do you have anything to do with regarding weed control within the borough?
In terms of other housing associations, the contract that we have in place just covers Bronavon and council land itself as well. So any housing association properties, generally where they will be located in areas where there are public footpaths and public highways and so on, they would be subject to treatment as part of that. But any land which would be owned by a housing association, excluding Bronavon, wouldn't be subject to treatment on their land.
Okay, you happy there, Councillor Haller?
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a hand from Clarkson. So, Linda?
Yes, if I could just ask a supplementary on that, please, Chair. Regarding areas where we get public complaints of an overgrowth of weeds and we report those in to the council, how are those dealt with outside of the contract?
Thank you, Councillor Clarkson. It can often depend on the nature of the complaint. We have a street scene service with 5 area teams. So what we would ordinarily do is ask the team to undertake an initial assessment of that area. It might be that the team could be trimming in that area so they could deal with the weeds in that way. It could be that there's the option for some hand weeding to take place. And equally, the team does have access to a few operatives across the service who are trained and experienced in the use of applying glyphosate. So if there was a need to do that in a particularly problematic area which was prone to a lot of weed growth, then we would consider whether we would need to do an additional spray in such areas. But that would be sort of out of the ordinary. Usually it would just rely on the contract that we have in place, and if we have any additional complaints, you know, we would ask the street scene service to take a look and attend to them, and possibly use physical methods of removal would be the ideal in that situation. Thank you.
Okay, okay, Councillor Clarkson?
Yes, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, move on to the next question. I think I'll pass. I was going to do question 2, but I think we've partly covered that, and I think it's also partly covered elsewhere. So if I could ask Councillor Steve Evans.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The question relates to part 3.3. What do officers monitor how much glyphosate is used by the contractors, including the level of dilution?
Thank you, Councillor Evans. As I indicated in the previous response, we have weekly progress reports submitted to us from the contractor, and in those progress reports they not only provide information as to the areas that they have sprayed, but also provide information on the quantity of the glyphosate that has been used within that process as well. On this one as well, my colleague Louise Powell has some further information about the contract arrangements as well and the process. So I'm going to see if she wishes to add anything to that response as well. Thanks, Louise.
Hello, councillors. As Dan mentioned, we do receive progress reports from Complete Weed Control, and part of that information is the amount of litrage used. We have it broken down by the last 5 annual years. So we do monitor that information, and it is reducing on an annual basis. In terms of the application process, they do use world-leading infrared machines that target the weeds specifically, and they spray onto the leaf, and it's not a residual, and it only activates when it hits the plant, and the glyphosate goes down right to the root level, but as soon as it hits soil, it deactivates. So there's no or very little drift, so it shouldn't get into water courses. It's only applied to the plants using spot spraying, not blanket cover at all, to minimise cost.
Thank you, Louise, for that extra detail. Are you okay with that, Councillor Evans? Yep, great. Thank you. So, next question is from Councillor Ashley. Question number 4.
Yes, it follows on from that. In terms of methods treating Japanese knotweed, especially infestations, do we spray or inject with glyphosate? As a councillor, I have a pretty good idea of where most of the persistent are in my ward. Is it correct that glyphosate does not get into the water course if it's injected? Bear in mind, Louise, what you just said.
Yes, councillor, it is spot sprayed specifically onto the individual plants because the glyphosate doesn't become active until it hits the chlorophyll. And then as soon as it hits the soil, it doesn't, it deactivates, so it shouldn't go into the water courses.
So I'll be specific in asking the question I'm going to ask now. Bear in mind I have sat through a fair few courses on it. We spot spray, do not inject into the plant.
Yes, that's my understanding. We spray.
Can you find out actually what we do? Because I have sat through over the good few years that I've been on the council this very thing, because that's the question. And do we get round all the other questions, the supplement to this? Do we actually get round all the stuff that's, bearing in mind the small window that we have in September, which I do know for a fact, do we actually get round all the referrals we have? Do you know that?
So,
we've got record.
As detailed in the report, the approach to treating Japanese knotweed is slightly different in that we treat Japanese knotweed with in-house operatives, whereas the weeds on hard surfaces are treated via this contract that we have in place. The approach to treating Japanese knotweed is, as Louise has outlined, to spray the plant, and then the chemical will travel down through into the root to destroy the plant. In terms of the coverage of Japanese knotweed, we try as best we can to map all the areas where there are known growth of Japanese knotweed, so that we can regularly monitor and treat as and when necessary. So in terms of whether we get around every area, I haven't got the information to hand at the moment to give an indication as to how many of the areas we know about are subject to treatment in September, but we do have an approach, and we can follow up with confirmation as to how much of the known areas are treated in the month of September. Obviously, we've not yet come to an end of September, so we could probably look at this month and get back to you in a couple of weeks after we've collated that information.
Thank you very much for that, Dan, because it is obviously, in terms of casework in each ward, it's a contentious issue. Obviously, it's something that affects homeowners because of house sales, that sort of thing. You obviously you have fair map on it, do you?
Yeah, it's one of the things that we plot on the system that we use for mapping certain things. So it's a part of our GIS mapping arrangements. Yes.
Thank you very much for that.
It's helpful confirmation. Thank you, Councillor Ashley, and thank you, Dan. We look forward to that. So if I can move on to question 5 and Councillor Clarkson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. We're looking specifically at 4.21 of the report. The Cardiff report was conducted during COVID, which were extraordinary times, and when the public were far more understanding of staff redeployment and some of the issues that created, weeds being one of them in this area. So do we have any concerns with the timing of the research? And also there seems to be a bit of a conflict in the data regarding the complaints when you look at the total number of complaints made. The higher complaints, if you look at them as a percentage or a ratio, they're actually slightly lower than the results for glyphosate. So they're comparing as well with 2020 pre and 2021 when the trial took place. So is there any indication of how that was looked at within the context of COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Clarkson, for that question. It's an interesting point and possibly one that we can raise with the researcher. From my perspective, I would probably say, in terms of my views on the research, as I've read it and sort of digested the information, it's an interesting point about people's tolerances and whether people were less likely to make a complaint during COVID. There could be a school of thought that because people spent a lot more time at home and in their communities, then their awareness of what was going on in their localities and on the highway and public spaces where people were using much more than they would have otherwise pre-COVID, things were more noticeable. And from my experience within public protection, that did have a knock-on effect in different types of complaints because people were more aware, had a bit more time to show that attention and actually take the effort then to complain about certain things. So there could be two schools of thought. There could be a camp which would think that people could perhaps have been more tolerant, and on the converse, perhaps people were more aware and more inclined to report as well, is another school of thought. But the points that you make are very interesting, and I think we will look to ask the researcher for their views on, particularly, as you say, the data and how that's been interpreted, and also whether there was any confounding due to the impacts of COVID as well. Thank you.
Okay, you happy with that, Councillor Clarkson?
Yes, if that's something that could be brought back to us, that'd be much appreciated.
Thank you very much. So, question 6, if I could ask Councillor Elizabeth Haynes to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Very quick question. The 2020 petition to Torfaen Council offered an alternative, this being hot phone. Why has TCBC not trialled this in the last 3 years?
Thank you, Councillor Haynes. When the petition was considered, my understanding is that we were aware as an authority that various trials were taking place in terms of weed management approaches, and we were looking at the evidence that was available and the trials that were ongoing and how they were likely to report on that, rather than embarking on our own approach to a trial and replicate what might have already been going on out there. As members will be aware, we delayed our view on the use of glyphosate whilst awaiting the trial findings. So that is the rationale as why we didn't undertake our own trial as well, because we thought it possibly more cost effective to look at the research undertaken by others.
Okay.
Can I just come back on that, David?
Yes, by all means.
Other than Cardiff, what other trials have you had the data from then? Because I would be very interested to see that data.
So we were looking at also the information that is described in the report, so any government advice and guidance that's produced as outlined in the report. We've also spoken to other local authorities in terms of what approaches that they've adopted in Wales, and also the authorities as have been outlined in the report. So the ones that have adopted residents undertaking their own weeding and the use of seasonal. So the different approaches as outlined in the report are the things that have been considered, but we regularly track the centrally issued guidance, the government's advice that's coming forward on this, and you know, if any scientific information was to tell us that we needed to take a closer look and to think about the mitigations that we have in place, then we would be acting on that.
Okay, all right, you okay with that, Liz? Okay, I think that's a clear response. It'll be, and I'm sure there'll be further questions and things to consider. So, Stuart, you've got a hand up, so...
Catch them down that where necessary, we do a manual weeding when we have to. So maybe we got some minimum experience doing it ourselves. So he must have some experience doing manual. What which I had heard that. So I'm wondering whether we use brushes and other equipment in the council already doing this. What's the experience, Dan? Yeah, I'm going the other way there a bit, saying that obviously our teams have got some experience of doing this already.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Ashley. As is indicated in the report and our proposals going forward, the intention is to, as far as possible, move away as much as we can from the use of glyphosate unless absolutely necessary. There is work that is undertaken by our operatives to remove weeds. So as I indicated earlier, when street scene are out undertaking their tasks, you know, if they are strimming in an area, clearly strimming will take place to remove weeds where they're able to. There might be some hand removal of weeds that take place as well as part of that process. So it depends what people see in areas. It's interesting to reflect on the findings of the report as well, and sometimes when you use the physical methods, it's not all that effective in terms of having a long-lasting effect, because when you try to hand weed, more often than not, you find that you leave the root within the ground, so you get regrowth quite quickly. One of the conversations that we have had with a local authority who is using equipment that can be applied to strimmers to try to remove the whole weed as part of the process. Those type of equipment are still sort of in the trial phase, but it's also worth reflecting that any manual intervention to remove weeds is hugely resource intensive and costly as well, so there needs to be that balance as well. So where we can do it, we do it. As you've heard, we largely use particular technology to spray on hard surfaces. We don't spray blanketly, and we don't spray in parks and on verges and the like as well. You know, so we control and manage the approach to using this chemical.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
I mean, all I was to make a side observation is it's all over the garden press that you can put wire type things onto strimmers, because they try and sell me stuff like that. So yes, I wouldn't be surprised at using kit like that and thinking maybe if you hit it often, then it does have some effect. Yes, thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Ashley. So I move on to Councillor Steve Evans for the next two questions, questions in 7 and 8. So Steve, are you happy to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And they're both to do with 4.2.9. With regards to any environmental impact of glyphosate and alternatives on pollinators and other bugs, how does this align to Torvine's climate change and biodiversity responsibilities?
Thank you, Councillor Evans. I think for this one, I'm going to bring my colleague in, who's our ecologist, Rachel, and she'll be able to answer the question around biodiversity, and then perhaps I'll come back in on the climate change one then. So thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. I think you're quite right in what you're saying, and that is one of the considerations we need to have. We do have a climate and nature emergency declared. Emergency is the operative word. And we also have a public bodies biodiversity duty under Section 6 of the Environment Act. The latest advice from Welsh Government, which was a letter sent in June 2023, it outlines a discussion that was had during the Senedd questions on the 3rd of May about minimising the risk of pesticide use to allow native wildflowers to grow throughout the summer. They obviously advocate managing green spaces in a more biodiverse manner to combat the nature emergency. And in regards to pesticides, Welsh Government policy is now to reduce to the lowest possible level the effect of pesticide use on people, wildlife, plants and the environment. And they encourage all pesticide users and chemical applications to only use chemical control where absolutely necessary and consider non-chemical approaches first wherever possible. I think I'll firstly apologise for Steve's absence today, Steve Williams, but I think we're both on the same page in our views on that. We would prefer to move away from a blanket approach for treating urban vegetation, we prefer to call it, as opposed to weeds, with the connotations that come with that. However, we do understand that pragmatically there will be some areas that will need to have applications of glyphosate and other methods, but we would prefer a more nuanced approach and only treat in selected areas where it's really required.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah.
And in terms in terms of the response around the climate emergency as well, so picking up on that after the response about this biodiversity aspect, I'm just referring to the trial findings, and that the indication of the trial is that overall glyphosate, by comparison with the other approaches that were tested, has a smaller environmental footprint. So this is considering the broader environmental factors, not just the chemical itself, but obviously the range of factors that they considered. And I think the trial looked at 18 environmental factors, and generally glyphosate was considered the best from that perspective in terms of environmental impact. Thank you.
Okay, Steve, are you happy with that?
Yeah, I was more concerned about the areas of sensitivity, particularly with that, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, I noticed Councillor Ashley's got a hand up, so a brief intervention, perhaps.
It's not a side issue, but I just wanted to ask this. Rachel, where are we with the neonicotinoid ban? Because this does have a bearing on this. Some householders will be using it. The glyphosate in comparison with neonicotinoids is, I can never say the word properly. Like, are we off or on with the neonicotinoids at the moment?
I'm not aware that we currently have any use of neonicotinoids in.
No, I wasn't implying that we were. Gardeners and commercial gardening are banned on that, but I believe it might have been rescinded. I've just wondered because it might have a bit. Some householders are allowed to use it. My worry is that some people use it next to where we operate, and I'm just being careful to ask this question because it's a moot point on the other thing I do, which is allotments. And I'm just asking you this question just to be clear that we don't get confused with it. You see where I'm coming from here?
I do, yes. Thank you, Councillor. I would have to look into that more for you to provide you with an accurate answer, but I can come back to you on that. There's
a bit of a row going on in the horticulture industry and allies about that because they're saying they can't exist without it. And there's a row. I only say that because I don't particularly want this to get involved in this. But when you've got that going on in other places next to where we're operating, I just thought it would be useful to be clear about that. I mean, I'm not a great fan of either, personally. I will say that. But the point about it is where we're talking about global climate change and nature emergency, those of us who are in the organic movement, and I declare that interest, don't like either. But be clear about what's going on. Yeah, and I think you're well aware of this problem.
Thank you. I think that's one that, as I say, is slightly related, but slightly to the
No,
side.
I'm being careful what I say, Chair, but that's the reasoning behind this, and it's useful to point the context rather than anything else.
Thank you, and I think it's helpful that Rachel's taken that on board. So
Thank
I'll
you.
go back to Steve for your second question. And
thank you, Chair. Weed burners were previously used. Although there are risks, is this an option going forward? And should we consider more options than the 3 options considered via the Cardiff trial?
Thanks for that question, Councillor Evans. I think if we refer to the report in the information and discussion section, the different weed methods available to control weeds are generally sort of outlined there. So cultural, physical, biological, and then the integrated approach. So in reviewing the report of the trial findings, the indication is that the alternative approaches that were trialled in Cardiff were considered to be other eco-friendly approaches. So that's why I understand that those were approaches that were trialled. In terms of burning, I think this is something that has been undertaken historically. From my understanding, it is probably unlikely to be an effective approach because of the cost associated with it. It's very likely to be having a negative environmental impact. So it's going to be hugely costly. It's likely to cause damage to surfaces as well. So, and there's also likely to be human risks associated with that from a health and safety perspective. So I think, you know, that approach is something that might not even be an acceptable way of treating this type of vegetation because of the risks associated with it. So possibly why that wasn't also considered as part of the trial approach. But as I say, the indication from the report is that the 2 alternatives that were trialled are because they were considered to be eco-friendly, is my reading of the report.
okay, thank you. Apologies, I dropped off for a moment. So I hope you had an answer there, Councillor Evans, and I know Councillor Clarkson would like to come in.
Yeah, only to say that everything got a risk, but to use this glyphosate, that seems to be a big risk on its own. So all I was asking, do we look at all options rather than just specific for a chemical type?
I think that will useful point. I'll bring Linda in.
Yeah, it's just expanding on that slightly. The 3 options that we used as the most eco-friendly, there's still some disparity on the amount of research on the actual impact it's going to have on the sort of ground condition and the biodiversity within the area, how it'll affect our insects and ground dwellers. So is there any way we can possibly get more information on that? I know it's sparse out in the research world, but can we look at that more specifically so that we've got a more rounded sort of understanding of the whole risk when using these methods?
Thank you, Councillor Clarkson, and we can take that away as well and ask the researcher as well as to some of the considerations that were given and to understand more broadly whether there are other options that could be feasible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. Question 8, I think we have largely covered that because you indicated and I think Rachel's response about taking a fairly hierarchical approach, but I will give Councillor Ashley the opportunity to phrase the question.
Yes, well, it's the phrasing of the question and the culture that goes with it, which is the important thing on this one. Yeah, it's reference 4.2.11. With regards to integrated pest management, we are taking a hierarchical approach and only using targeted spraying of glyphosate where other methods are suitable. And obviously what we're looking at is integrated pest management, cultural, physical, biological, chemical, and integrated pest management. What we're looking at practices within the horticultural management system. And if you look at the way that's going, look at RHS and people like that, I think it's inverting the way things are always done. And obviously there is an implication there for more than just saving money. It goes back to what we'd already discussed about nature emergency and the rest of it. Now, why I bring RHS in there as well, but everybody is onto this at the moment. And I think we need to look at the way things are done, and they've been done. We're on the tools, that sort of thing. Last time we did this, we got that. I think you guys have got it by diluting and the rest of it. But I think there's a lot of a mindset like Nundig and all the rest of it is coming in the movement, and not mowing and the rest of it. So it's about management, and it's about how we get from one way to another way. And I think we're onto it as a scrutiny committee as well. So it's how you manage this situation to minimal spray. Now, I can't, for the love of me, find a way round, as somebody that's actually been a practicing organic gardener for the last 30, 40 years, around glyphosating Japanese knotweed, for instance. There isn't a way around it as far as I know. The Swansea studies say that. So I need to get how you get your amenity gardeners round to that mindset, because there needs to be a seed change in some. That's opinion on my part, but I also think this integrated pest management is a seed change. When you got RHS looking at it like this as well, how do you guys respond to what I've just said there? Because that's what that's saying to me.
Okay, thank you. If I can open that up then to officers, probably Rachel and Dan on this one.
Yeah, Councillor Ashley, I think, in reference to your approach to a hierarchical approach, that is, very, very topical in terms of the information that's come forward from Welsh Government, and particularly with the National Action Plan. That is advocating a move away from the use of chemical-based herbicides to actually adopt an integrated approach, as you've suggested, but you've also indicated that in certain circumstances, as is the case with Japanese knotweed, then as it currently stands, there is a necessity in some instances to have to use these chemical herbicides. But I think what I would say to what you've said is that we are working towards the Welsh Government advice and the new National Action Plan that has been developed with a view to reduce over time the amount of glyphosate that is used, and by considering alternative methods and constantly looking at what research is undertaken and what products are on the market to facilitate that, to do it in as resource effective way as possible, being cognizant of financial pressures as well that the public sector is facing, as well as thinking front and foremost the human implications and the environmental implications. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Rachel, to that.
Yeah, I think it's just to say, obviously I'm coming from an ecological perspective, so maybe slightly different from other angles, but I think urban vegetation is highly underappreciated. They offer a huge value to pollinators, and it's public perception, and that is a huge challenge that we need to address. It's very difficult. It's a change agenda, and that is always challenging, really. There are some research papers on the benefits of weed growth and urban vegetation, and some would suggest that actually the abundance and diversity of pollinators using weeds or urban vegetation average twice that of other plants. So I think there's a bit of a change agenda as well that we need to look at. We accept that in the case of Japanese knotweed, that there probably isn't at the moment anything more effective, or in terms of reducing that down and treating it. But I think it is just going along that selective approach at the moment and going in line with Welsh Government's advice to reduce pesticide use wherever we can. Obviously, not spraying near areas of grassland management that we're currently managing positively for biodiversity. And looking at, do all pavements need weed management? You know, I would personally, maybe controversially, argue that they're not a trip hazard. Others may have a different opinion, but I suppose there is a place for that in certain areas, and other areas maybe we could look at things a little bit differently. That's my personal opinion.
Okay.
Thanks,
Can
Rachel. I think you know, the proposal that is within the report around having a risk-based and place-based assessment is key to the point that's just been made there by Rachel, isn't it? So.
Yeah.
Can I quickly come back? That cultural thing, and it says it there, leads us to the risk base, and I mean the scrutiny I'm going to be doing later in October is all to that, and I think it's very pertinent to this discussion that we use minimal use of it. As I said, I had a problem when we did the last one. I had to go around saying this is the council's official policy and this is my view. I have that problem because I've been a lifelong organic gardener, so I got a double view on it. The thing is, I also have that problem with Japanese knotweed because there is no effective thing against it other than the one thing done in a particular way. And that goes back to Swansea's study of about, I think it's 20 years ago. We can't import the thing that's effective against it from Japan because we don't know what it would do to our vegetation. So
I think that would open a whole new can of worms, wouldn't it?
It certainly would. It import another alien, we don't know what it would do. So
okay.
That's a respectable view, to be quite frank.
I think we've had a clear answer there from the officers. So thanks for that. I can see that Councillor Haynes would like to come in. So Liz.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Oh, sorry. Typical, isn't it?
Okay.
Sorry about that. My phone was ringing. Typically, just a bit of a comment, really, about this question. There's growing concern in other countries about the use of this, to such an extent that other countries have banned it. Retailers in this country, some have taken it from sale. So for me, it's really important that there seems to be a move towards not using it with this council, and I think we need to be ramping that up. I'm aware that there are alternatives available, although they are more costly. And I'm wondering, what is the reason that we are not moving away from we're not moving away more at speed from when there are alternatives? Because when there is a risk that is being identified by other countries and retailers, we really should be looking at using alternatives, even though they are not as cheap as what we currently use.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point, and I think probably the next question really is asking some of that for a bit more detail. So can I perhaps, bearing in mind what you've said there, Liz, and bring Councillor Clarkson in with the next question to build on that?
Yes, please. Thank you, Chair. With regards to the Welsh Government advice and the National Action Plan, is Torfaen considering the human environmental issues in balance as with the financial and carbon issues, which the report is very much heavily weighted for? And on the back of that question, I would like to ask, you've mentioned that you're looking at doing an assessment as to reducing use and where it would be appropriate, where not. Timescales on that report, please.
Over to you, Dan.
Yes, thank you. Just in terms of the factors that we consider when having regard to the approach that we take, as the trial also looked at, they looked at cost, environmental, customer and quality. And, needless to say, as I referenced in my earlier response, front and foremost for us as a council is ensuring that anything that we do doesn't have a significant detrimental impact on the environment, and equally doesn't cause harm to residents. So we're really cognizant of that. I think it's fair to say, based on your question, Councillor Clarkson, and the comment made by Councillor Haynes previously, the approach that we are taking is one of a managed approach. It is very difficult, particularly based on the comments that Rachel made earlier around public expectation and potential risks, to take a complete shift in approach overnight. So this has to be a managed approach to phasing out the use of glyphosate. And we have to consider a range of factors in that. Cost is one, inevitably, which is going to have to be factored in. If there are alternative approaches other than the ones that have been sort of set out in the report that have not necessarily been brought to our attention, we would welcome learning about some of those, and perhaps if there is research that Councillor Haynes has in relation to what other countries are doing, that would be very much welcomed, so we can consider what is happening in other countries. I will say, you know, we do need to refer back to the science and the evidence within the report and in official guidance. You know, a lot of what we do has to be directed by regulation, science and evidence, and as it stands at the moment, this is still a regulated product, so the harm of it is assessed, and obviously this is a balanced and managed approach that we need to consider going forward. So, and in terms of the risk assessment, we were looking to set up a project following the meeting, and obviously we'll need to consider comments arising from the meeting in terms of how we look at things and what we look at going forward. So there's no hard and fast timescales yet. We would hope to be in a position to have an early report on this in time for our next contract award. So 2020, 2024 sometime. So we've not done the project plan to determine timescales yet. So apologies, I can't be really definitive on this, but I don't want to commit to something that we would then not be able to deliver. But we can get back to you on that.
Okay. I know there's two hands here. Linda, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just wanted to emphasise that the report, it is looking environmental, but it's looking at carbon footprint and water use. So there are the other considerations which the ecologist has raised, and we've also raised on the impact on what we're doing with the biodiversity in an area, and the invertebrates that live within that area. So it's just broadening out that aspect and acknowledging it in any report or evaluation that we do. And there has been mention earlier that runoff isn't an issue, but everything that I've read about it is that runoff is an issue, and it can get into our waterways. So again, for that to be sort of fully considered within any evaluation of how we use this within the borough.
Yes, thanks, Councillor Clarkson. And just to say, as part of the process, we will work very closely with our ecologists to make sure that that more rounded approach is considered. So it's absolutely a valid point there. And just in terms of the runoff, just to clarify as well, where the points were made in that regard was around the use of the particular technology, which helps to limit as far as possible the amount of runoff. So you will get more runoff if it is applied indiscriminately. But obviously the technology that we use limits the amount that is applied, so that also has a reduction on the effect of runoff as well. So that's where we get the assurance from that perspective. Sorry, Chair.
Great. Thank you, Linda. That's helpful to emphasise that. I'm conscious we've still got quite a few questions to go, and other members who have yet had the opportunity to ask their questions. So, Councillor Ashley, you got your hand up, but if you could make a very brief point, if it is.
Yeah. I'm also sympathetic to Dan's problem as well, because end of the day, pragmatically, if we come up with the environmental argument, he has to take into consideration how he's going to do it, and there are how he's going to get it to the standards that he's got with the chemical treatments. And now I understand that completely. So we're making the arguments we need to be able to make the arguments and do the business. So I understand that he's got to prove that and get the stuff in place. So I think that's useful. He's made that point, and I think we're aware of that, Dan.
Great, thank you very much. Councillor Haynes, you wanted to make a little point as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I noticed Dan wanted me to send him some information on where it's banned. I'm happy to do that. A very quick Google whilst I've been on shows me that 10 countries, including Mexico, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, have restricted its use. So, some that have banned it, China, South Korea, Colombia, Peru. So I'll send all of that through to you, Dan, so that you can take a look at the evidence that is there's a lot of it on the internet.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful, Liz. I can move on because question 11 then from Councillor Nick Haller, which does relate to this, and then it'll be Councillor Parish on number 12. So, Nick?
As we're all aware, the licence for use of glycerylates in the UK is up to 2025. What contingency planning has TCB put in place or putting in place if this licence is not extended?
Thank you, Councillor Haller. I think it in responding to that question, aligns to the other points that we've made around integrated pest management, but also looking to reduce the use of glyphosate over time. So should that happen at that point in time, we will obviously need to take stock and look at what would be the most feasible options to put in place, having regards to resources, cost, and so on. So a clear answer would be there isn't as yet a contingency for that eventuality. However, we would probably need to really scale back if we were relying on physical methods alone and not chemical methods, and be realistic on the areas that we could actually actively treat for weeds. We might have to take a more proactive approach. So, if that eventuality did arise, we would have to completely alter our approach. But what I would say is, our approach aligned to the Welsh Government advice will hopefully, over time, get us into a space of using as minimal product as possible over time.
Thanks for that. Are you okay with that, Nick?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, do you think that the government would actually, do you think the government would actually give you some advance notices that if there was a chance that they were going to stop that? Maybe not, maybe not.
Moot point, I think. So if I can move to question 12 to Councillor Norma Parish.
Thank you, Chair. What benchmarkings have been done against other local authorities, and could we have widened our research further than the focused report from Cardiff Council?
Thanks, Councillor Parish. As I mentioned in the previous response to one of the questions, we did have regards to other approaches taken by other local authorities as well, so they're referenced in the report. And we've also had conversations with colleagues in local authorities across Wales. It is stated in our report and the research report that glyphosate is predominantly used in most local authorities in the UK, so there are some exceptions where they've taken an approach not to use it, but in the main this is the approach that is followed. So going forward, as we've indicated, we are constantly keeping an eye on the research, the information, the guidance that's available to see what alternatives there are. I did mention a particular local authority that is looking to use more machinery-led approach with particular attachments, but again, we need to wait to see the outcome of that approach and what that tells us in terms of impacts on the environment more broadly, how effective it is in terms of quality, people's perception of it, and so on and so forth. So we have undertaken quite a bit of research, and also linking in with organisations that have collective input. So APSI, as an example, in the amenity forum, has referenced in their sort of pool information from a wide range of sources. So it isn't just based on the information in the Cardiff report.
Yes, but I think it would have been good to have had a wider picture at how other authorities work and what they use and how successful their methods are.
Fair point, I think, Councillor Parish. Could I also ask, as you know, perhaps to give the opportunity here, in terms of our colleagues from Bronavon, if they've had any benchmarking and picked up anything that might be useful to share?
It's me then. I suppose, in short, our approach and process is heavily reliant on our partnership agreement and our partnership approach with Torvine. We've been monitoring the Cardiff trial as closely as you have over the years. So I'd have to say we rely on you guys in Torvine for that leadership and that lead on. You know, we're sort of how can I put it? We're a partner, but we'd have, I mean, personal feelings aside, to do with glyphosate, you know, I would always align to the approach and the science that you kind of, you know, and the approach that we're taking. If I had a different view, I'd say. If that makes sense.
No,
sorry, a bit rambling.
That's helpful. Right. That's helpful. Are you happy, Councillor Parish? I think we've made a clear point there about sort of comparisons and information. Yep.
Okay then.
Okay. I think we may have touched a little on the next question, but Councillor Clarkson?
Yeah, as usual, Chair, I have amended it and expanded it slightly. So the question is, the report shows that hot foam is the most effective method, but have excluded it as not sustainable because of the carbon footprint that it puts forward, the cost and the which is mainly down to workforce and the water issues. But I note in the report that the producers, manufacturers, or whoever supplied that equipment said that there were options regarding the use of electrical vehicles. So the question I've got really is, would hot foam be an option around more sensitive receptors, places where there's a high public footfall, people may linger longer along our waterways, if the application of it was done in a more environmentally friendly way, such as electric vehicles?
Thank you, Councillor Clarkson. I think on that point, yeah, we would need to have a conversation with the researcher and understand more about the methodology, I suppose, that was used and how they considered the impacts of the different approaches. I'm not in a position to answer that because I don't know enough information in terms of the approach that was used and what the impact could be of using electrical vehicles and so on and so forth. So it's a really valid point, and I think it's one that we would usefully be able to put forward to the researcher to get some further information on that as to whether that could be an option in certain areas as part of an integrated management approach. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's very helpful and clear. Next question is actually from me. We noted in the report that Brighton City Council, this is at 454, I should say, struggled to control weeds after ceasing the use of glyphosate, and trip hazards emerged. So are there seem to be any legal risks relating to weeds on pavements and car parks, such as trips on the weeds themselves or due to cracks in the ground caused by weeds? Welcome views on that.
Thank you, Chair. The risks, you know, we've highlighted some of the risks within the report, but you know, I appreciate it could be expanded on. The local authority does have a duty of care and an obligation to maintain its hard surfaces, its public footpaths and so on. And without an effective method of weed control, there is the potential that weeds could cause a trip hazard or could cause damage over a period of time. And I say that, bearing in mind the comments that were made by Rachel earlier as well, from an ecological perspective. So there are risks of litigation to the authority if the way that we were managing weeds or not was presenting this particular hazard. We also need to think not just from a trip perspective, but also in terms of accessibility, so particularly for wheelchair users and people with disabilities, weeds can cause a problem from that perspective. They can also cause a problem from those using the highways in terms of visibility if they're left to get too large. So there are a range of risks that could exist, which could present risks of litigation to the council. You're right in saying that, Councillor Williams.
Okay, so it's obviously something we need to have due notice of, and I think a couple of subsequent questions will perhaps lead into that a little as well. So, question 15.
Councillor Williams, sorry, Chair. Colleague from Branhaven would like to come in.
Oh, great, thank you.
I completely second that. I mean, again, personal feelings aside and other comments aside, we have had one payout on a personal injury claim specifically due to weeds. Probably 2 years ago.
Yeah, about 2 years ago. Can I just add as well, with the weeds in Brighton, a company has been approached now to spray the footpaths in Brighton.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, they've actually, I know that from people that work at Brighton, and they have actually approached a firm now to actually go out and spray the weeds because they're just out of control.
Okay, that's helpful. So we have a little bit more information subsequent to the report, so thank you. I'll move on to question 15, and I'm conscious of time, so I think if we can try and move through these a little quicker, that would be great. So, Councillor Clarkson.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at 4.56 of the report, it's been noticed that it's been mentioned that Lambeth Council have done this, but I know Exeter Council also had an opt-out scheme where residents were offered the opportunity to opt out of spraying and to maintain their areas themselves. So the question being, have we looked at all of the available opt-out or self-management by resident schemes? Would we be looking to consult with residents about this in the future? How would that be agreed? Could we identify then how that would be agreed by a street by street in a sustainable and a suitable manner?
Thank you, Councillor Clarkson. In answer to the question as to whether we've considered the range of schemes that operate out there, we've considered the ones that we've received information on and that have publicised information. So there could be other schemes out there which we could benefit from learning from them in terms of their approach. In terms of using residents in the community to take responsibility for weeding in their areas, we could look to consider this as part of the wider community strategy, and the approach that we adopt would need to sort of reflect our approach to working with the community and residents in that. So obviously there does, as you indicate, there does need to be buy-in from residents for that to happen. There needs to be careful consideration about the sustainability of it and the managed approach to make sure that we mitigate the risks, and we've mentioned risks through some of the risks throughout the conversation. So we really need to bear in mind that as well, and also need to have regard to unintended consequences as well. So briefly, as mentioned in the report, there is a risk that where you introduce some of these schemes, that some residents could take it upon themselves to apply their own methods of treatment which are not hand weeding and could actually have a more harmful effect on the environment They could be purchasing their own glyphosate in a branded name, and they could be applying it far more extensively than we would be using our methods. Equally, they could also apply other products such as diesel, salt, and other things that are referenced in the report as well. So it's those unintended consequences, how you would go about managing that would need careful consideration. But it's a fair point in that, you know, it really would be valuable in trying to learn from others out there to see what their experience has been and how then this could be broadened into our sort of community strategy and community-led approach on dealing with things that the council has traditionally dealt with as well. Thank you.
I think, Linda, you wanted to follow a little?
Yeah, just briefly, we could surely look at that within an actual and potential risk strategy within going forward with evaluating the benefit or the potential of this. And it's about risk aversity, really, isn't it? So it's a balance again, and that would be down to how that scheme would be managed and presented. So yeah, it'd be good if we could look at it and widen out our scope of what's happening elsewhere. Thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you. And I think I was going to ask a little bit about the risks, but I think you've covered that off. So I think we go to question 17, conscious that some of that's already been answered, I think. But Linda, I think you may want to just check out a couple of points on this one.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much been covered. If we get this report at the earliest possible opportunity, the evaluation of where it's more appropriate to use, how we protect our waterways, our high footfall areas, areas where people may linger for longer. I think that that issue of sensitive receptors would be covered within that. The question was basically about how we manage the use of glyphosate around sensitive receptors.
Okay, so if I move on then to question 18, just to say there's 24 altogether, so we're getting towards the end. So this is, if I could bring Councillor Parish in for here, please.
Thank you. I think this question relates to 5.2 in the report. Do you have figures in relation to complaints from residents regarding the use of glyphosate, compared to the number of complaints regarding the amount or size of weeds in Torfaen?
Thank you, Councillor Parish. At the beginning of the week, we run a report looking at complaints relating to weeds. And I'm very conscious I keep referring to them as weeds, and sitting close to my ecologist colleague, and so apologies if it causes any offence. I am conscious of that. But we did undertake a trawl earlier this week of the data, and this isn't a complete data set because we are working on how we make sure that we capture all queries and requests for service that come into the authority. But as an indication, we receive several complaints each year relating to concerns about the use of glyphosate, and some of those are from the same individual each year. In terms of complaints that we have about weeds and weeds causing a problem, we have several hundred complaints each year. So just looking at the number of complaints that we've had since March this year up until this current point, from memory it was circa 250. I suspect that's quite high this year because of the particularly wet summer that we've had. When comparing it to previous years, we haven't had as many complaints as that, but we have had well over 100 in previous years as well, nearing 200. So we get far more complaints about the presence of weeds than we do about the use of glyphosate or any herbicide product.
Thank you. I think residents are obviously not satisfied. So that indicates to me the glyphosate method isn't working satisfactorily. Not that I want it at all, but it is not working satisfactory. And if it rains, apparently it washes it away. And I mean, in this country, we have rain, and this is going to go on year after year. And I think it's time to use another method, or have pilot schemes of other methods which are safer, so we can work on those schemes. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I bring, got a couple of hands here, but I just wanted to check if Bron Avon colleagues had anything about complaints to add to that.
Broadly, I mean, I haven't got the numbers top of my head, but broadly the same. I'd say we probably have one complaint, maybe multiple complaints, but one complainant related to the use of glyphosate, and maybe not in the 200s, but certainly multiple complaints related to weed control, etc., and observations that we pass on.
That's just generally down to missed areas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's that's the complaints are normally areas that have been missed, which they go back and retreat. Right.
Thank you for that clarification. So, okay, Councillor Ashley, and Councillor Haynes again, mindful of time, if we can be fairly brief.
I'm going to be fairly brief. Dan made an interesting point with the with the ecologist about weeds. The definition of a weed is a plant that grows where you don't want it. This year, I've been going down the lines with my gardening of actually letting them grow. I mean, dandelions and various other plants. And the move in gardening and ecology these days is to let them grow. Obviously, if you've got them growing in paths and various places, what I'm interested to examine, because this might have a pertinence on part of our integrated system, is to stop them growing in the first place, or encourage them to grow where you don't want them, grow where you want them. Now, I'm interested in ecologists about, but if we look at this approach, it's different from the old-fashioned approach of obliterating the things. This is happening in gardening as well, where you go non-dig gardening and don't disturb the thing, because if you dig the ground, you will get weeds, no doubt about it. And the most persistent weeds, knowing your patch, like a lot of us do as members, if you walk around, it's really interesting what grows. So thinking that approach through, wet springs, cold summers, the like of it, have we actually looked at that, the ecology of the weeds that actually grow in our... It just struck me this is something we hadn't actually done. And I want to know what the ecology of all this is, because
okay, I think that's
a really interesting point, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a specific question for Rachel. So
for Rachel, definitely, and Steve would be the pair of them would be good at this.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good point. I think you probably need to look into that a little bit more. Just to go back a little bit to the amount of complaints that we've had about weeds, urban vegetation.
I love that.
It might be interesting if we could look at, of those complaints, the reasons for the complaint, just to look at whether it is more aesthetics, public perception of everything being neat and tidy, or whether it is a genuine trip hazard, health concern, access concern, because that should narrow down, or should help to narrow down whether certain areas actually do need to be treated, because obviously with lots of other projects ongoing, we're looking at natural networks under our local nature action plan. We've got Nature Isn't Neat, which is sort of expanded from Monmouthshire. It's going back to that public perception, which is challenging. But if we look at the complaints of weeds as a whole, if most of those are for aesthetic reasons, maybe we need to look at more education and perception side of things, rather than just responding to weeds from a health and safety point of view.
Can I just very quickly come back and get on this, because one of the things that drives a lot of people mad, and you see it all the time, is actually Buddleia. You've got Buddleia davia, and I believe there's an awful number of buddleia species, but Davia is the one that came into the country first of all from Southeast Asia. My wife's actually growing black buddleia, and as a pollinator, they're amazing. But if you go
Okay.
in the street, you don't want it. I just make the point about buddleia because it's a well-known thug, and that is one that sets a lot of people off.
Okay, I think that's a relevant example, and we've noted that. I know Councillor Haynes would like to come with some comments, and I'm going to move the committee on a little.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on what Norma said, I was going to raise it at the end of the questioning about Wales being wet, and it is. It's known for being quite wet. Mindful that, and it's a couple of years since I've looked at the manufacturer's advice, but back a few years ago it said for best results a rain-free period of 6 hours and preferably 24 hours is required after the application of this product. So how does the council monitor that spraying doesn't take place in the rain? And does the council actually test any groundwater? Because if we are spraying and then it rains, it is possible for it to seep into the watercourse.
Helpful point. I don't know if Rachel or Dan would like to offer some comment.
Thanks, Councillor Haynes. I'm going to bring Louise in on this, who's a bit more informed in terms of our contract arrangements as well on the application. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, Councillor Haynes. Within our contract specification, it is noted that the first treatment will be undertaken during suitable weather conditions between April and May, and then the second treatment will be undertaken again during suitable weather conditions in September and October. So that is part of the contract specification and part of the tender process. And as Dan has mentioned, we do have weekly progress reports and updates, so we are aware if any areas have been missed due to weather conditions that need to be revisited.
Okay, Liz, do you want to check anything?
No, we'll pick this up in the recommendations, I think.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, moving on. We have question 19. That's Councillor Nick Haller.
Thank you, Chair. How do I start this? Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen engagement to advertise this event, this meeting today. We've received emails that has given us some more information to discover. But why hasn't there been any formal engagement taking place with the community regarding the use of glyphosate?
Thank you, Councillor Haller. The paper has been prepared for the committee with the findings of the information from the trial in Cardiff and other research and studies that are out there that we've come across. In terms of our proposed approach, we're cognizant that we need to apply the approach which is in line with regulations and government guidance, which is, as Rachel has outlined and we've explained as we've gone through the committee. The intention is, following recommendations from the committee here today, would be that we would undertake an exercise to engage with the community, but we need to understand what our options are as well. So, posing a question to the community as an example as to whether people are in favour or not of the use of glyphosate might not be hugely helpful without understanding alternative options. And again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of understanding why people might have a concern about the presence of weeds. As Rachel has indicated, is there something that we need to do in terms of altering people's perceptions around weeds and understanding better on a risk-based approach, as we've advocated, how we might better manage weeds and change perception around weeds. But there is probably quite a piece that needs to be done in terms of educating. So to get the best out of community engagement, this has been part of the early process in that happening.
Okay.
So, Dan, will there be engagement on this after the process that you've just discussed happened?
Yes, so as the proposal is to look at areas, so place-based assessment and risk-based assessment, as part of that process, there'll be engagement with residents. Yes.
Thank you.
It's helpful, thank you. Nick, sorry, did you want to ask?
Back into me again, sorry. This is just a general question. And some of it's been answered already. So spraying is only done on dry days, and like people have just mentioned, we live in Wales. So to avoid getting water down and washing into the water systems that we've already discussed, are there also on recycling days, are these sprayings avoided to avoid the spraying of receptacles that are handled by residents? Sorry, I haven't said that very well. Basically, I'm playing on the days that we have recycling going on. Do you go into those areas because potentially there is a risk of contamination onto those recycling units?
No, thank you, Councillor Hawler. As I said previously, it is targeted spraying, so they're spot-on spraying specific plants using an infrared machine, and there's no or very little drift, so there really, in practice, be no residual spraying going to anywhere else other than the plants, and because it is quite costly, they do spot spray in particular on the specific plants.
But there are streets within our communities that have recycling bins out on a daily basis. They're not moved. And there are weeds or plants that are behind those
urban plants.
Places, we call them plants, that need to be sprayed, unfortunately. But those days, does the operative move those containers? And if they do, is there a chance of actually putting spray onto those containers?
That's something that we'd have to look into and check the practice on, to be honest, Councillor, so we can certainly come back to you on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Right, we've only got a few more questions left. So again, if I could urge brevity, that would be welcome. So Councillor Ashley, number 21.
I've got two sets of questions here, David. I'll go from one to the other, if I may.
Sure.
21 is 6.1. We're talking cost implications. What is the cost implication change, and have we sourced financial information around this from local authorities using other methodologies? By the way, I found another methodology when I was poking around, which we did briefly look at, which was thermal using electric. I hadn't seen that before. There's another one there for you. Just thought I'd poke that in there, but for good measure. You got gas and electric. I've never seen that before, but there we are. We had that conversation. Sorry, that's just an aside there, but I thought you'd like that one. It's a methodology, how much the methodology costs, because you talked about it all the way through, Dan, so we might as well have that there. We'd look forward to hearing about that.
So a simple answer in terms of costing alternative approaches, we've not undertaken any costing exercises as it stands at the moment, but obviously we can make comparisons to the Cardiff trial as to how costly the options that they looked at were, and sort of compare that to what we do in Torfaen. And it's also worth bearing in mind that it's difficult to make that direct comparison between the different methods, because the different methods have different degrees of effectiveness. So it might be, if you're reliant on a physical method, that physical method needs to happen 4 times a year, whereas the spray might need to happen twice a year. So there's a lot of variables to take into account. So costing it could be quite a challenging exercise. So we've not undertaken that as yet.
I would also suggest, bearing in mind that we've also talked about nature emergency and carbon capture as well, cost-benefit analysis and process for your different methodologies, which we also talked about earlier. The other one that goes, in fact, my second bit does go back to this. 6.2 is we're taking full account of the carbon footprint involving the use of glyphosate and other methods. I'll be fair to you on that one, including its production and the impact on the environment. obviously that people are mindful of that and the things that we've discussed in this scrutiny. So I've just sort of answered my own question there, but if you're coming back to us on this, sorry about that, Dan. Any other officers got a view on this as well? Because we do talk about the cost, and the cost is a little bit more. It's the social, the implications around social costs as well, and carbon cost.
Okay, I think the essence of that is about sort of taking the full holistic cost in terms of production of materials and spread. So if officers would like to give a view on that, that would be very welcome. Again, brevity appreciated.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. There is something that we need to consider in terms of carbon footprint. Glyphosate is a byproduct of fossil fuel. And all the manufacturing, the packaging, transporting, applying chemicals all produce greenhouse gases. And there are links between pesticide and herbicide use and climate change. So anything that we can do in terms of reducing that will help to address the nature decline and the climate crisis. So it's something that probably we need to bear in mind and perhaps needs a little bit more research.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's.
Can I ask a question of Rachel on that? Do you actually have a factor in where you can cost that out in terms of nature and climate emergency? I kind of recollect there was a way of doing it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see Linda's got her hand up as well. So, Linda, anything you wanted to check on this?
Yes, please. I'd like to keep it brief, but I just noticed that in the report, the Cardiff report, the trial, they were spraying 3 times a year glyphosate, and we only sprayed twice. So it may be prudent at some point to look at adjusting the cost figures so that we have got a more Torfaen-based sort of indication of the cost implications.
Yeah, valid comparator. That's a helpful point. Councillor Ashley.
Yeah, very briefly. The exception to that is our old friend Japanese knotweed. There's an implication of Japanese knotweed on the housing market as well. So as a member of the planning committee as well. Obviously, there's a whole cost implication in there. If that's done by operatives, the effect it has on the local indicators for housing. That is also picked up by the housing market itself.
Yeah, I think the clear point is we need to take as holistic a view as possible, which I think has been drawn out by members. So we're more or less coming to the end. So there's question number 23. I'll go to Councillor Clarkson because I think we've covered some of this, but I think there's some points that's helpful to raise, Linda. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could. It's going back to the conflict in Torfaen County Borough Council policies in terms of wildflower areas and our urban sort of flowers. How are we actually balancing that out, and how are we going to be able to do that? I know there's going to be cooperation with the ecologists, but I'm thinking specifically of the seed bank. We allow them to grow as wildflowers in one area. The wind is then going to do its thing. Birds are going to do their things. They're going to disperse the seed across a wider area. And then that sort of puts that imbalance in the urban flowers not being where we want them to be. And then they become an issue. So it'd be interesting to know how we're going to sort of actually balance those out and make sure that our policies are compatible. And also the medium for these to grow in, if we're not keeping channels maintained really well, gutters, the sides of pavements where pavements meet walls, where we typically see problem growth, then there's the ideal medium for them to grow. So is that another area that we could look at in more detail as to how we prevent weed growth by managing the medium in which they want to grow on our hard surfaces?
Okay, so
I'll hand this across to Rachel, our ecologist, if that's okay, Chair.
Sure, of course. And as I say, if officers from Bronavon want to offer anything as well, that's very welcome.
Thank you. I think it's a good point. Good question. I don't know how you would manage that because, you know, urban vegetation and all plants have their own way of doing things. Unfortunately, it's a natural process that is relatively impossible to control. Once a flower seeds, which is, you know, in the case of controlling things like Himalayan balsam, you tend to pull them before they flower because once that seed bursts, it's going to disperse. I don't know how you control that, and I'm not sure from an ecological perspective whether I'd want to control it. But I think in terms of what you're saying about them growing in areas that we don't want them, like channels and guttering and other things, I think it's probably down to maintenance teams and the resources to ensure that they don't have the preferred conditions to start with and that they're kept on top of and kept clear, so that we don't get to a position where they need to be removed. But again, that's resources and capacity, which is a little bit out of my control, I'm afraid.
Do any of the other officers want to come in on this? Sorry.
Yeah, resources and capacity. I mean, you know, best one in the world. Litter picking. Sweeping takes probably 10 times longer, and yeah, we're at where we're at with that kind of, you know.
But that could be something that we need to look at in specific areas where it would be identified from the evaluation that it's not desirable to have them in this area. So we could look at improving cleaning and removing silt and old leaf mould, that type of thing.
Yeah, can I come
Just
in
a
on
suggestion.
Okay, Councillor Ashley wants to make a brief point.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, the other place where glyphosating is done and is suspected of doing is park management, the canal bank and other places. It's certainly been observed, and I wonder about this sometimes. Within the management of those, because we're also planting up urban woodland, and some of that, you know, that there's a slight controversy with our residents on that. Also, Bronavon's got that as well. So that management of that, where it's got brambles, or it's desirable to have brambles and stuff like that, and scrubland. If we're planting up urban woodland, you know how we manage it. There's a good team in there as well. I've had discussions with Simon on that as well.
Yeah, I think the overall point is that the committee are making here is that if we're taking this place-based approach, which seems a very positive way forward, we need to be considering the physical environment and on a case-by-case basis how we look at how we're looking at the spread of urban plants where we don't necessarily want them. So I think I was just going to check, Councillor Haynes. I know you had question 25. I don't know if you've already covered that or if there's anything further you want to add.
No, I think we've covered that, but there is one other point I'd like to make. Having read the Pesticide Action Network UK website, there is one paragraph at the bottom that I would like to highlight, and it says, "It is absolutely possible to go pesticide-free without compromising on cost, efficiency, quality and customer satisfaction. The question should no longer be, is this weed removal technique better than glyphosate? But rather, how can we go pesticide-free in a way that is most suited to our local requirements?" And that pretty much sums it up for me.
Okay, that's a good concluding comment. So I'll just check with members if there are any. We've gone through the questions we had pre-arranged. You'll be glad to know, officers. I'll give members the opportunity to check if there's anything further they want to add, but I think we've had a good range of supplementaries. I can't see any hands raised. So can I say thank you very much to all the officers who've attended and for your contributions and your responses to our questions. We know we had quite a lot at you, and it was probably a bit more of a marathon than a sprint, but we have appreciated your candour in approaching our questions. So you are now free to leave, probably with some gratitude.
Thank you, Chair.
What I would remind members is that we are still on camera, and we will then be moving to the phase where we look at potential recommendations from this scrutiny. If Niall, you could advise us once the chamber's been cleared.
Yes, Chair, the officers have now left the meeting.
Okay, thank you. So can I remind members that what we're asked to consider is and come up with recommendations around noting the findings from the independent trial and provide some recommendations for consideration by the executive member for environment to inform the future approach to weed management. I think all our questioning has been aligned to that. So thanks very much, and hopefully everybody had felt that they were able to make their point clearly. So I'll open the floor, really. I don't know, Geraint, can I just sort of say for any key points you've picked up? I'll just bring in Councillor Haynes. Sorry, got a hand there, sorry.
Yeah, go on members first, Chair, and then I'll fill in blanks at the end if there are any, if that's okay.
There were just a couple really for me. I know there's loads but specifically for me it was the contract that she read out about the use of glyphosate in the rain. It's very, very vague. And I think that our recommendation is that contract, if it, I wish there wasn't a contract, but if we have to have a contract, it needs to be much tighter on how and when it's used in the rain, because if it's used and it rains within 6 hours of its use, it is seeping, and that is a concern. I would like to see some testing of the groundwater to rule out any of that seeping, or just to make sure that what we are contracting people to do is being done correctly, and that we can evidence-base that with some intermittent groundwater testing. And I'd also like to recommend that we trial the hot water in this borough, not relying on Cardiff. The demographics are very different. We're in a different time. As Linda said, it was done in COVID, and I'd like to see that trialled and be a part of a recommendation.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very clear. So thanks for that, Liz. If I move to Linda, then Norma.
Just to expand on Liz's point, whether we could have some area-based trials on the IPM methods as well, just to make that a bit broader and do it in a place-based sort of way. But obviously we need that report as quickly as possible of the risks and evaluation. The other point that I'd like to recommend is picking up on the ecologist's point that we need to have more information about the nature of complaints.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see that immediately added to complaints forms, and the way that we gather complaints, that people are actually asked the reason for their complaint. I know when I'm reporting, I usually give a bit of a reason as to whether it's felt to be a trip hazard, or it's obstructing the pavement, or whether it's just that it looks unsightly. But that needs to be added to the way that we gather that information as soon as possible. And I think, we need to put the recommendation in that those extra conversations happen with the researcher to clarify the points that have been raised today that couldn't be answered within the chamber.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair. So, Norma?
Thank you, Chair. Well, it's very much like my predecessors, what they've said. Complaints, we really do have to take them seriously, because, it's obvious our residents are not satisfied and they need to be taken seriously. And if we have, more information on what sort of weeds, or are they big clumps of grass or whatever, we need to look at that. And we need to look at other ways of killing our weeds. I know that sounds awful to kill them, but you know what I mean. We really need to look at it seriously this time and not hang around, because glyphosate isn't working and it could be really seriously damaging. So we need to go and look quickly at other methods as soon as possible.
So I can see that connects. Yeah, I can see that connects with the points that both Liz and Linda have made, you know, which is actually, we actually want to test and trial using other methods as a direct approach here within this borough, as I say, lessons from Cardiff.
As I said earlier, you know, pilot schemes. I mean, you know, what's stopping them doing it? They could have done this by now over the time, you know, they've sort of hemmed and hawed over everything, because I think I made my self clear, was it 5-6 years ago? And you know, it's still going on. That's ridiculous.
I think at the risk of an awful pun, the more you kick this into the long grass, the risk of it sprouting up again comes.
Yeah.
So before I go to hands from Stuart and Linda, can I just check, Nick, if you've got anything you want to ask? I can't see a hand, so it's
sorry,
just...
Sorry, not seeing my hand because I'm here.
That's what I mean.
There's a couple of questions. We talked about engaging with the community, and after this meeting we were talking about that we would engage with the community. I think we need to find out what kind of engagement the Torfaen are thinking about doing, because obviously this is quite a controversial issue. And what will they do at the end of that engagement, and how will they take it on board? I think at the end of the day, if there's an awful lot of people within Torfaen that say that they're really, really anti this, then will Torfaen have to back down a little bit on what they're doing and move, like Norma's saying, into another area and trying an alternative, which is, in some ways I get, but in some ways I don't. So, but from the point of view, yes, we're making a decision. We're talking about how we move this forward, but at the end of the day, we're talking about a community that wants to get involved as well. And how much of an influence will the final decision be made by what is said by the community? We've seen the emails that have come in recently. We've seen the fors, the against, and everything else about it. But what will the final influence come from, and where will the final decision be made?
Can I just come in there a second, please? That sounds more like further questioning of the officers rather than a specific recommendation.
I think it's a recommendation to say what they're actually going to ask. I think that's the recommendation.
Yeah, so I think there's probably a recommendation about sort of there's been mention made of taking forward a place-based approach. Yeah.
They're saying that they're going to engage with the community, but they're not saying how they're going to engage with the community. Does that make sense?
Okay, I'll bring people in to see if we can broaden that and clarify that a bit. So Stuart first, Linda, then Liz.
I'm being quite honest. I was really shocked about Japanese knotweed in question, because I thought we had quite a good system. Now, with a small window of opportunity to treat it. Now, I've got a very simple, practical system here. Each ward should be mapped as to where the stands of Japanese knotweed are. Each report back on where it is, and it should be treated systematically, because I'm not convinced that's how it's done. It's done on a methodology where it comes in, they treat it as it comes in. So GPS it, which it can be done with the system we've got, treated on a year by year so that we know where it is. The bit about spot spraying or injected, we need that reported back annually. And then each ward member or cluster of ward members should know where it is. It's a fundamental economic problem. I can't believe it. Sorry, but a logical approach to this is, as I said, GPSed it, treated year by year, and then as it comes in, there should be a reporting system. There probably is, but we need to know that as members, because
Sure.
it is a members' question. So a
Okay.
logical system, asked to be done like that. I would like to see it injected, not sprayed. I'm not convinced about that. I've seen the test papers going back from Swansea nearly 20 years ago. So we need to ask that question. I need to have a logical system in place, and really shouldn't have officers being vague about it. The head of that service should know about it. So, across Wales, that's a fundamental thing. I didn't believe what I was hearing. I asked a couple of simple questions there, and there should be a fairly definite answer to how it's done.
Okay, fair point, and I think hopefully we've captured that. Again, mindful of time.
It might be that he's a fairly new officer and didn't know the answers, but and the exec member should be able to come back on this as well.
Yeah, and I think we have to bear in mind, yes, we've got she's in place as an interim role, so yeah, I'll move on.
Can I just say one thing? That is a completely different system to the rest of what we're talking about. As I said, there is no other way of treating Japanese knotweed at the moment.
Yeah, I think we've got quite a specific suggestion there as a recommendation.
Yeah.
So Linda, then Liz.
Okay, regarding public consultation, which we've identified as very important towards a risk management sort of approach as soon as possible, can I suggest that as a recommendation, we ask that a suitably worded and comprehensive public consultation is carried out, which is brought to and agreed by members prior to publishing?
I think, yes, we need to make sure we're taking the lessons of the waste management approach.
And one other is if we can look for external funding. A lot of these requirements are as a result of Welsh Government, UK Government requirements on biodiversity and the environment. So is there actually any extra funding out there that we could possibly identify that could be tapped into?
Okay, yep, I think that's nice and clear. Yep. You got some of those okay, Geraint?
Yes, no problem, Chair. One thing that's more of, I don't know if it's more of a comment than a recommendation, but I just don't know if you wanted to make reference where the officers mentioned that during the past 5 years, year on year, the use of glyphosate has gone down. I don't know whether you wanted to mention as a committee whether or not you have any views on that, whether you're pleased.
I certainly do when I get a chance to come in. Our integrated pest management system, that will stop that.
I think
I'll wait until Liz gets in, all right?
Yeah, I think we need to have that information. You're right, and let's not lose it. I'll go to Liz.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Again, I've sent you all some information via email. It's quite substantial. Yep. There are 3 links there, and I think there are something like 162 countries that have banned this chemical. It is quite, you know, I'm strongly opposed to this as Norma is. And I know, Norma, I remember the meeting that you were really quite verbal about, and here we are years later, we're still using it. For me, one of the recommendations is that we very quickly move away from the use of glyphosate wherever possible, and also look for, and I'm being very specific, move away other than knotweed, but whilst also looking for an alternative to knotweed, so that eventually we can be a leading council in Wales and maybe the UK in taking this awful chemical away, because there is evidence that it's seeping into food and water and even it's been traced in wine, which is obviously through the grape. So for me, the recommendation has to be that this council moves away from its use as quickly as physically possible.
So I think this is what I'm hearing here is that very much taking forward implementing this IPM, but having that very transparent, and we need the data, I think, as Niall has indicated, exactly how the fall of glyphosate use has gone, and our expectation that this will continue to reduce year on year. just putting a few extra elements within that. So
well, that's where I want to come from. We look at the integrated pest management system, but we weight it towards getting rid of the bit we don't want, right?
Yes.
And we also put in there a methodology which we've been handed by the ecologist, which hopefully I will be doing that when I do cross-cutting. The reasoning is quite simple, and Liz has put it there quite nicely. Thank you, Elizabeth. Which is obviously it's global climate change. It's the nature emergency. If you listen to the news today, it's bloody frightening, and it's also our cultural bit about people. So that lot together is frightening. There's good reasoning behind it. We don't use it unless we have to, and you Japanese knotweed is the one.
I think the point has been made very, very clearly.
Yeah.
I'll ask Linda
but we put the systems in place where we put the alternatives, and we use what's best practice. They admitted themselves they use it when they need to. You talk to the men about it, they've got the systems in place. So we come best practice that doesn't use that. And it says it on there. We only use it when we have to. So we put a management system in there that works in our favour.
Yes, I think we need the clarity, as I say. At the moment, it feels very much
they
like...
can't argue. We also go for cultural change in the whole system, which is why I asked that question. But and we got the various things on our side, like agricultural and horticultural people are now working in that direction. And if I did mention the RHS, and they didn't demur from that.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have to stop you there, Stuart, because I'm conscious of time.
Please do.
And we need to. I don't want to take more than we have to. I know people are very passionate about this, and rightly so.
So the question there is how quickly they can put that into place.
Yeah. Okay. Linda, briefly, and then I'll ask Geraint to sort of summarise. I've got Nick as well about where we are with recommendations, so we can run through those. Obviously, recognising that those can come out to us as well for finalisation. Linda.
Okay, I'd like to make a specific recommendation that during the risk assessed place-based evaluation report, that they identify areas with increased maintenance and removal of growing medium would be appropriate. There's in some areas there are a few years worth of this, so it wouldn't be an annual or a twice or three times a year. You know, we could do this on a one-off basis, and then that would keep it clear for a number of years, but that we continuously evaluate and monitor this. And that we look to seriously consult on the opt-out during this process as well. I know that residents of Brandir maintain their own by hand weeding. They're not all using salt diesel. We could build that risk assessment into that approach, but it would give residents an extra alternative in the now. So anyone who's got incredibly strong feelings about it could opt out in the now. And just one other thing, just that we make sure that we have adjusted these trial results that they're putting so much weight on, so that they are Torvine specific and not just taking the evidence that is presented, because they have used different methodology and it is a different urban environment.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, Nick.
Hi guys. Liz talks about trying to reduce what's going on currently with glycerites. 2025, potentially the licence might be revoked, and if it is, could there be a question on how quickly they are going to put an action plan together to resolve that issue, and if they're not doing anything now, why aren't they doing anything just in case it does? And by the way, there's lots of people around the table that are really, really anti using this. So couldn't this be a process of actually finding an alternative to removing glycerites? Well, the word is, I can't get out.
I think there's a clear strand here, Nick, which is actually about, if we're moving to this integrated pest management approach, we need also to take consideration that glyphosate may no longer be licensed and our expectation is that a plan is being considered for Torvine should that eventuality arise. Something on those lines.
Yeah,
Yep.
there isn't, by the sounds of it, there isn't a plan being studied now just in case. And if a survey said within the community that we wanted it to be removed.
So could we suggest future-proofing our weed management programme?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think essentially what we've got here is it's felt like, if I summarise, it's felt like, well, we've been waiting for a report, we've been waiting for a committee, and now, we want to see what you're coming up with in terms of recommendations and actions. So I think we can be quite strong here. I'll move to Geraint before I come to you, Stuart, so that Geraint, if you could just run through what you've gathered from our sporadic elements of conversation so far.
Yeah, no problem, Chair. It looks like quite a lot of recommendations, but I suspect when I start start sorting them out, then some of them will be able to be merged into large ones. So just correct me in case I've got anything wrong. So I've got issues around the contract. They need to be tightened up in terms of the criteria around the weather. You'd like to testing done on groundwater to see in terms of any glyphosate levels within that. You'd like to see a specific hot foam. Well, first of all, you said about a specific hot foam trial, like a pilot in Torvine, but obviously you moved on then to saying that that could be part of a larger
testing a range of methods.
A few methods at the same time. You want further breakdown in terms of information in terms of complaints, so there's a better understanding of exactly what are the issues that the public have.
And information gathered at that point of complaints.
Yeah. What was that, sorry?
Information gathered at the point of complaint as to that's what the ecologist was suggesting. That seems a valid point, is that we do ask, is it because it looks unsightly, is it a trip hazard, is it blocking pavements, so that we can be more objective again in evaluating that information.
Okay.
Also on that first question you mentioned about the contract, we asked the question about moving recycle bins and everything else around that. So to firm up the contract on what happens when they go out and spray on those days that recycling bins are in locations, because that wasn't very clear on the fact that it was coming back. It could be that there could be carte blanche down the street, and because there's a lot of recycling things in the way of the flowers or the weeds, then we would be in a position where it wasn't actually completely done. Does that make sense? Yeah. And there's also the cross-contamination onto containers that potentially could go back into the households, and the effluents going on, the weed killer going on to those containers. So there's a cross-contamination going on, but there wasn't any clarity on what that situation was. Did they actually move those out? And that could be useful, because that would actually put us into a situation where, from the health and safety risk of contamination into the households, then we're eradicating it, but we don't know the answer yet, because they didn't know if those containers were being moved. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think we can pull that. Yep.
Yeah, to carry on. Obviously,
Councillor Geraint. Yep.
Yeah, Councillor Hall obviously mentioned about the wording of the engagement with the community, and then obviously on the back of that, members also said about once the wording was sort of put in place, that you wanted it put to members first before it was published as part of the consultation.
Very much so.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
There's the point around each ward should be mapped and treated systematically in terms of Japanese knotweed, and the report should be sent to the relevant members, on an annual basis.
Yes.
Yeah.
The other aspect of this question in whether it should be spot sprayed or spot injected. Yeah. I want to question that.
Okay, it's okay, no problem.
That could actually go onto the Sparsham mapping system. The areas of knotweed could go onto that system.
Okay, to see whether there was any extra funding that could be used in this area, any external funding that is. That obviously I'll put this one further up the recommendations where you've all agreed that as soon as possible you'd like the council to move away from its use of glyphosate unless it's absolutely necessary, and that Torvine could be a leading council on this approach. And then I've got, I will need this one a little bit tightened up because I didn't quite catch it. Is around the risk, the place-based assessment. Councillor Clarkson, you said about identifying one-off examples. I didn't quite catch for the point to put into the recommendation. Sorry. One-off examples.
I think this was actually about taking an approach to take forward a cleaning treatment. This was, I think, more based about, if we've identified where those risk areas are, we can do a fairly thorough clean in terms of removing growing medium, etc. I think it was a silting up type thing.
Right. So prevention was part of that.
I think hard services, car parks are a classic example. I very often have to report car parks for cleaning because there's a lot of build-up of silt and a growing medium within those. And once that's done, that can be a few years before I have to worry about it again. So it is about identifying within that place-based risk assessment and management programme that they're talking about getting done before 2024, that is sort of looked at in more detail and identified.
No problem.
If you circulate them, Geraint, we'll...
Obviously, once it's all typed up, I'll share it with the committee, and then you've got a few days then to come back to me with any amendments if I haven't quite got the tone right of what you're trying to get across, or whatever.
That's great.
Only a couple more left then. Last but one, I've got about the needing to adjust the trial results from Cardiff to be more Torvine specific. I was wondering if that could probably be merged into the recommendation around having some pilots within Torvine. That should. Those pilots should probably tease out the Torvine specific information.
Yes, I think the bit there. I think the relevant, a key point I think that Linda made was actually that the Cardiff trial and basis was on sort of 3 sprays, etc. Of glyphosate. So I think we're indicating that. Whilst being mindful of the Cardiff report, we need to take account of this setting and this regime.
Specifically, we only spray twice a year.
Twice a year.
So it's that the research doesn't really relate to the situation in Torvine specifically.
Okay, and then the last one I've got is that an action plan should be put in place should the licence to be able to use glyphosate in the UK be revoked post 2025.
Yeah. Right. Well, while I got my hand up, there's 2 things missing there.
Okay.
One is the integrated approach that we talked about. It's an integrated management approach was rather important because it gives us a way forward to minimise the use of glyphosate or even get rid of it. That's the approach that we're looking at. And number 2 is the finances, because I did quite a long conversation a bit on that. Is the cost implication for change, which the questioning was on. They did say they'd come back on that. And the carbon footprint costs. This is the cost side. I'm sorry to go on, but resources rather important on this, and it's not about trials or anything like that. If we're going to do this, the implications have got to be built into it. So, the integrated approach has to be finance, and if we can get it to work for us, and they're saying glyphosate is cheapest. That's a debatable point. And then if you do the community approach, we can build that in as well. So all those elements have to be built into the finance approach. I'm not convinced that it's any cheaper or less expensive. It needs to be built into evaluation of what they're doing there.
We need to look at the greater carbon footprint as well, don't we?
Yes. It's not that.
It's a fossil fuel.
Last time we got
it's fossil fuel based, so that needs to be looked at within current policy guidance and upcoming legislation.
But once you bring the community into it, they see this straight away. And your idea and Nick's idea about using the community as well, like we do with the lister and that, we have to turn the mindset round.
It's giving an option more than using the community, Stuart. Giving people an option to opt out immediately. Some may feel strong enough to do that, some may not.
I also think about positive use of the community, because they want in, like they have with litter picking and stuff like that. That's not an option, that's the way of life, and it's mindset changing. A lot of really interesting things there, how the community views themselves in this. It's about partnership.
Yeah, I think that's implicit and it's included. That's why it was helpful to see the cultural element within
the stuff that came out at the end, I thought was really interesting about ecology and our use of our land. It's not about being untidy. It's a lot in there, and I think it's important. And even when we're talking about cost, it's not a cost. The cost is something the community bears. And it's part of this. I keep banging on about social contract. That is really, really important. Why are we doing this?
So do we ask them to make sure that the management of urban plants aligns with the management of green spaces, verges, and word that in such a way that
I think if I can,
you're there, Linda. That's good.
I think if I can come in, what we want to see is bringing together the management of the urban plants on pavements alongside the management of our verges, etc., so that we actually have a joined up approach to taking this forward. I think I've got the sense of that from what you both said.
Yeah, can we mention policy specifically though, because we have got policies which seem to pull us in different directions, and we just need to find the middle.
We need to align
in the
policies.
immediate term, so that while we're moving away and
the
looking for
reason I asked about
alternative.
social media was the community engagement. Was if we get the community behind us to be able to engage with the community and tell them the good points about why we're trying to do what we're trying to do, then we're going to get the community behind us. If we just go in there carte blanche and say this is what we're doing, and then not
that's why we want to see the consultation.
So that's why it needs to be framed. Okay, if I can go back to if I can go back to Geraint. Geraint, have you?
I think that's. I've got it now, Chair. Yeah, obviously, I'll share. I'll sort these out and I'll share them with the committee, and we can before I send off to the exec member.
So, colleagues, are we happy that we've fed through all the relevant elements? I think Geraint now has got to make some sense of this. Not always easy with the frequent interjections, but hopefully we've got the detail. Geraint, very happy if you can pull that together as soon as you can, get it round to us. And again, if I can ask all members to respond as promptly as possible so that we can get this set of recommendations out, because I think we all sense the urgency of taking action here.
I also add it's got to be workable for officers to understand this as well. I did make that point. It's not wild, woolly environmentalists. This is workable stuff, and it's the seed change for them.
But I also think that, given what the report said, we are being asked very clearly for the recommendations and suggestions. So I think it's entirely right that we make these. It's more about actually helping to inform policy going forward, which is why I think this was a very good scrutiny discussion, rather than actually sort of tinkering around the edges. So, yeah. Are colleagues happy that we can conclude this meeting? Mindful we've run over a little, but good discussion. All right. So thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions, and we look forward to coming back together again. We haven't finished the agenda because I've also got to pick up on the item for next meeting, which at the moment is down as cemeteries. Geraint, do you want to just confirm on that? I don't think we're looking to make a change.
No, it's just to make sure that the committee are happy for me to work on the pro forma. Obviously, that'll get sent to yourselves before I send that to the report authors. In terms of the short report that you're familiar with, there's nothing within Appendix 2 or 3 to change your mind in terms of not going ahead with the cemetery. So yeah, just clarification that you're happy with that.
I think all happy. I'm seeing, if not smiles, wry grins. So yes.
All I was going to say was cross-cutting's more the same because you've got global climate change and nature emergency. So if you've got a bit more of that, it's going to be on that one in a week and a half's time.
Great. Just to highlight then, the next meeting is on the 15th of November. We were very tight in terms of our pre-meeting and scrutiny meeting this time. So suggestions been made, which I think is helpful, that we try and have the pre-meeting a couple of days before the scrutiny meeting. I've mentioned this to Geraint, and Geraint, we're looking to take that on board, yes? Geraint?
Sorry, Chair. Yes. We'll have a look at the diary and see if there's any examples where other committees and things going on, say 2 days before, block us. Then the morning before would be helpful, because at least then it's, you know, we've got the bulk of the day to sort of work through it as a committee, and I can send them out and get them checked with yourselves, because yeah, it was quite a tight turnaround getting it done before the end of the day. Yeah,
it's great. Okay, so I think as chair of the committee, I'll thank everybody for contributions and say that we'll now close the meeting and recording can cease. So thank